And budgeting is the subject of chapter 6. I've never taught budgeting before, but I really enjoyed preparing for it. And I'll tell you why, because we all do budgeting. I mean, you all do budgeting either explicitly or implicitly as part of your managing your household finances. Some people are more explicit about it, some people are less. But we're all about somehow the idea that we want to bring more money than less and controlling it, right? So this is all essentially what this chapter is about. Now, of course, the word budget has been out in the news a lot lately because of the current crisis and the various stimulus bills, and you probably have heard about the federal deficit, ballooning tremendously as a result of all the money that the government has to borrow in order to finance the stimulus, the unemployment, insurance, and all this other stuff. So I was talking today actually to a friend of mine who's a pretty well-known economist here in town, who's a policy person, like a think tank person. He said, well, there's another aspect to that. Federal government doesn't have a constitutional requirement of balancing the budget. If the federal government doesn't have the money, what can they do? It can do two things. One is they can borrow the money, which is what they're doing right now. They're issuing treasury bills. And they're borrowing money from us, from outside investors, from outside governments, whatever. Or they can print the money because they have the ability to do that, which of course is not a good thing because it will devalue the currency. Now, not so much the state and local governments, that many of the state and local governments have a constitutional requirement of balanced budgets. So what's happening now is that because of that inability to borrow by state and local governments, they can't borrow to finance the deficit. The deficit is coming from the fact that they're spending money on on fighting the pandemic, but also on top of it, so many people are not working, their tax revenues are going down, and so on. So they're in a lot of many states are in a lot of very precipitous difficulty right now because they have no money to pay their firefighters, they pay the teachers. So much so that the Republican leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, said that maybe states should declare bankruptcy. So this word budget is a lot of meaning for all of us, should have a lot of meaning for us. We should all think about it. So budget on a basic human level is just the idea, like what do you bring in versus what you spend. If you bring in versus more than what you spend, then you are in what's called in the green or whatever, or in the black, and vice versa, you're in the red. Now, budget is a document which is an outcome of budgeting process. Budgeting process is the process of developing a budget. It's essentially a financial plan that very much like the forecast that we developed when we did the forecasting chapter, right? We had this forecasting spreadsheet. And that forecasting spreadsheet had elements of how much are we going to sell at what prices, what are we going to spend, what's going to margin going to be, various assumptions. So that was essentially a budget for a company. I don't know what exactly is the difference between the budget and the forecast. The line is somewhat blurred to me. Obviously, budgeting involves forecasts. Maybe the difference is that the budget is a formalized document. It's part of the sort of a broader formalized process. I don't know. Now, I like when your book talks about budgeting up front, I like how they really emphasize, Zimmerman really emphasizes the notion that budgeting is not about being exact. It has two purposes. One, it has a control goal, meaning meaning what? We're going to compare budget versus actual, right? So did we meet the budget? Did we miss the budget? And That's the control. But there is also information gathering, if you will, strategic planning purpose to the budget, and that is collecting information to develop the budget. And what I like in the book is that how Zimmerman points out that the process of budgeting, what it forces people to do is to share information, And that strategically forces this knowledge, he likes to talk about this knowledge or information within the firm, that strategically forces it to be shared across different lines of the organization. And because of that sharing, because everybody gets to see the budget, then suddenly different parts of the organization are much more aware about what everyone else is doing. And that is absolutely true, because I've done budgets. And you see that happen all over and over. That's all over all the time. And that's the value of this process. That's the value of this process. Is that it forces information out into the open, in addition to, of course, being a controlling mechanism. Now, when we talk about short-term versus long-term, that's basically the same thing. That's the short-term is much more for control purposes, right? Because, because short-term, you can hold people reasonably more accountable because you have the information that's just more like, okay, what's going to happen next 3 months? But basically, we don't know, right? What's our immediate goals? So you can hold people more accountable. Long-term, like when you talk about a budget of 3 years, I mean, things will change. Everybody understands that. So the goal there is not to be right about what's going to happen in 3 years. The goal is to force strategic thinking and kind of scenario thinking about what's going to happen in 3 years, and to force that information out in the open. Force that information sharing across different lines of business of the organization, so that they're more coherent, more shared strategic thinking. That's the answer to question 2. How can budgeting be used as a performance evaluation tool? What sort of dysfunctional behavior problems does it create? Well, of course, we compare budget to, if you reward people on meeting budget targets, meeting forecast targets, what incentives will people have? Is to make sure, A, that they can influence, they want to be able to meet those targets because they want to get a bonus, they want to be rewarded. So if they have some input on what the target is, they'll try to lower it. They'll try to bring it down. Nowhere could it be seen more clearly than in the central planning economies, right? Remember Soviet Union, where I come from, was a centrally planned economy. Everything was planned, everything was budgeted. They were like trying to budget the whole economy. Everything was supposed to be coordinated. And obviously in that environment, because nobody wanted to miss the target, everybody tried to play with targets so that they wouldn't have to work as hard. So that's the basic problem with participative budgeting, for example, right? When people have influence over targets, and they'll try to opportunistically manipulate them to your advantage. What is budget ratcheting? Budget ratcheting is the idea of how the budgets are adjusted. So let's say this year you met your budget. So when you set a new goal for a year after, if you are able to meet expectations, well, it will be ratcheted up. Your expectations will go up. But there is no corresponding downward adjustment. In other words, if your budget was too optimistic, it typically doesn't get adjusted downward. So that's what ratcheting is about. Is it kind of you become the victim of your own success. If you do well, then you only get higher goal, higher target. But if you don't do well, you don't. It doesn't go lower. So what is the incentive that people have? They will be intentionally pessimistic in terms of setting those goals. So that's why budget ratcheting is a bad thing. Any questions, thoughts, comments so far?
No, it's good.
You guys use budgeting in your job?
Contribute to it, but not, I don't own that.
What's that?
I contribute to those who own it.
So can you tell us a little bit more about it? Like, how does it work for you?
No, I just influence based on, what my team's expenses are. So I don't really own like a lot of this.
So you don't really care?
I care. That's why I'm in your class.
Professor, I had a question about the short-term and long-term objectives of budgeting. I was just wondering if you go into a little more detail when you talk the short term and the difference between long term. I got the control purposes, but you could use that in both periods, right? I got the accountability, but you could use that in both periods also. So can you kind of just differentiate between a little bit more between the short term and long term, please?
Sure. So it's the degree of accountability that matters. And so imagine that you're developing a budget for next month, right? So by the time you develop a budget for next month, you have a pretty good idea. You have good information what's likely to happen next month, right? So that budget is going to be pretty accurate. So it's only fair to hold you accountable for meeting that if that budget is approved. It's only fair to hold you accountable for meeting that budget. Because you already pretty much, it's kind of a much easier exercise. You have pretty good information about demand. You have pretty good information about your expenses, your needs, and so on. So yes, from the goal meeting perspective, it's fair to hold you accountable because the target should be set fairly. Now imagine I told you, okay, go ahead, develop a 3-year budget and basic budget assumptions. And, in that 3-year period, there's a big shock that you couldn't plan for, like what we do have now. Is it fair to hold you accountable for meeting that budget or missing that budget in 3 years from now? The answer to that question is no. So then, or not as much, certainly. And the question, what's the point of doing it then? The answer is that it's more, the value of doing this 3-year process or 2-year, 1-year process is because it forces you to think about and plan, because budgeting involves scenario building, right? If you think about going back to my forecast and spreadsheet, what's a scenario? It's like me playing with different assumptions on the assumption spreadsheet. So instead, think about one set of assumption, one income statement. The other set of assumption, another income statement. Look for 10 of them, and suddenly it paints you a picture of what might happen. And that's what's much more valuable in a long-term budgeting. It's not so much whether you meet particular targets or not. It's forcing people to think through what could happen so that they much better plan and adjust for if something something bad does happen, right? So it doesn't become as important whether you were right, or not. What's more important is the planning aspect. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. It makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. So what's interesting, you've all heard about flattening the curve, right? That's a term. Do you know where it comes from? Does anybody know where the concept came from?
Flattening the distribution curve.
Yeah, well, that's a statistical distribution, but where the term originated. I just read about it this week. It's a very interesting story. Anybody? So, when I was in graduate school, you guys remember SARS epidemic?
Yes.
So this was 2004, 16 years ago. After the SARS epidemic, our NIH people, including Dr. Fauci, got really scared. SARS epidemic killed 800 people. And the reason why, but SARS is even more horrible disease. But in some ways, the reason why, because it was so horrible, it was so visible, there was no asymptomatic cases. If you got SARS, you got sick, and you got really, really badly sick. So the only reason why we didn't get a pandemic of SARS 16 years ago is because they were able to, because people gotten sick so quickly, they gotten really badly sick, they were able to contain it much, much better. Because you knew who the sick people were. But it really scared people like Fauci. So they basically went through a simulation game and wrote a manual. What do you do in a pandemic? And that manual came out about 3 years ago. And they got a bunch of epidemiologists to scour. The last time I had a major pandemic was in 1918, the Spanish, so-called Spanish flu. That was H1N1 flu pandemic that killed 50 million people, 100-something years ago. So a bunch of researchers got on and started scouring archives to figure out what worked and what didn't work in the pandemic. That's how, for example, in St. Louis, they shut St. Louis down. So the level of number of people dying in St. Louis was a lot lower than in Philadelphia, where they had a parade or something. I forgot what parade it was. So that's why they got the idea of like shutdowns essentially, because they know that cities in the 1918 pandemic, cities that shut down had a lot fewer dead people than cities that did not. That's what social distancing came from. And the notion of flattening the curve is basically a derivative of that. They understand, because of the structure of the United States public health and hospital system, stuff like that, they won't be able, they knew they were not able, they would not be able to handle the huge surge of patients in our hospitals. So they developed that, they developed 3 or 4 years ago the flattening the curve strategy. They said, okay, what we know we won't be able to handle it because we don't have that many hospital beds, we don't have that many ventilators, and so on. So we need to do what can we do in that environment? And they took it from the 1918 pandemic. They said, okay, one thing is we'll do shutdowns. The other thing, basically, and the other thing we'll do is we'll try to, we know we won't be able to contain it, but we will essentially try to prevent the overwhelming of the hospital, of the ICUs, essentially. And we will do what does flattening the curve do? Flattening the curve does not stop the pandemic. And but it just spreads it out. That's why the curve, there's no peak, the peak is flatter, but it's much more, it takes much more longer. Like for example, in Maryland, we didn't go up to as high as New York. New York went up and then down, right? In Maryland, it's like, it's flattened, but it's gonna go down a lot slower. We're gonna go through June. But that's an example of what the long-term budgeting process would do, right? It's not budgeting, we're not dealing with money, but they sat there and they thought strategically about different scenarios, and they came up with a plan for a particular scenario, a set of scenarios. And that's what the objective of the long-term budgeting is, essentially. All right, this was the digression.
Professor, I have a question.
Oh.
I have a question though. On budgeting at my last job, they would do the budget and base it on the price of the products for the current year for their product line. And then when I was there, I suggested they start adjusting, based on what their price is going to be in the coming year, because that's what the budget applied to. Have you seen or know of like a good way to deal with your products changing price and budgeting?
Well, I've done budgeting myself in a very limited way. I've done the budget for my synagogue, when I was a treasurer, and I deal with budgeting tangentially because budgeting is, of course, a big deal at the universities. It's all about budgets and being, dependent. So for instance, like what do I have to, for us, it's a big deal because, we constantly try to plan for enrollment, right? So you're essentially asking, I'm going to translate your question in my world. Have you, Professor Pevsner, dealt with various budgets, or has your university dealt with various budgets, projecting for various kinds of enrollment, right? What spending are you going to have if you have X number of students? What spending are you going to have? You're going to have Y number of students. Are you going to hire for this faculty position? Are you not going to hire for this faculty position? This year, unfortunately, the question is the other way around. we know we're all going to be in very, very deep trouble with our money, right? That's pretty much a given. So the question that worries me, and that I've talked to a number of people about it today, is that how much of a salary cut am I going to get? That's the practical question that I'm thinking about, right? And so the answer to your question is absolutely you should, in a good budgeting environment, you need to try to plan for price changes. The problem with price changes, it's a little more, I imagine it's a little bit more difficult to model them, because it's one thing to project student enrollments, in particular in kind of a stable environment. If an unstable environment, it's more difficult. So for prices, if there are no serious price fluctuations, if the short-term budget, it's probably okay to just stick with the current prices. But then you need, I think at least as a thought process, I think it's important to consider that. I think if you think there's going to be significant inflation, for example, which in the United States, right now we're in deflationary period. Prices are going, well, I shouldn't say that. The concern is we're going to get into deflationary spiral. In fact, prices on certain things are going up, but we may get into a deflationary spiral. And what do you do then? Because the problem with deflationary spiral is that it's very hard to get out of it. It kind of just self-perpetuates itself. What happens in deflation is that producers cannot recover the cost because the prices go down so much, they cannot recover the cost of goods that, of production. So certainly I would say, yes, you should consider that. I don't know if every company is different. It's kind of, there's no rule how you should do budgeting. It's just, I think you have to think about the risks that you have, and you need to, again, plan for those risks and think about budgeting as fundamentally budgeting is a process of systematic thinking about things, right? And trying to, again, look through scenarios of what might transpire. Does that make sense? Did it answer your question?
Yeah, it did. So you plan for it like it's a scenario, like
Yeah, I think
your
so,
product
yeah.
prices are going to go up.
Yeah, I think you need to, like, it's in particular, if you think prices will be unstable, I think it would be helpful. And that's the whole point of flexible budgeting. Flexible budgeting doesn't so much adjust for changes in prices, in fact, adjust for changes in volume, but fundamentally, budgeting is about building up different scenarios and trying to think about which scenarios are more likely and versus less, and planning in accordance with those scenarios. That's what I would say.
So just for an example, I don't want to go too long on topic, but I could basically budget for the quarter and then adjust every quarter. Let's say, you don't meet your targets, adjust the revenue stream or what I think is going to come in based on what happened quarter to quarter. But I've never seen a company do that. It's always been like, here's our budget for the year. And even if, let's say, coronavirus hit them and they had a bad quarter, they would never adjust the budget. So I've never worked for anyone who adjusted the budgets. But I can see now what you're saying is if I develop scenarios, it's more like a forecast and a budget at the same time. Then I could use the scenarios to create a forecast that shows them the adjustment, but let them stick with their same budget for the year.
So I think you're, and again, this is beyond my expertise already, but I think you're pointing out a very interesting distinction. I think, when you're talking about budgeting, when they don't change the budgets, I think you have kind of you don't want to be changing your plans too much all the time, right? You're going to have a long-term strategy of some fashion, and that's what this budget that you're talking about is, right? We have a plan, right? Within that plan, there are going to be fluctuations. There are going to be temporary price shocks, demand changes, whatever. So long as it's within sort of an acceptable range for a company, it doesn't make sense. It's too costly to adjust budgets. Because remember, budgets drive, cross-organizational decisions, allocations, spending plans, right? especially more complex, it's not that easy to just go ahead and adjust it. And then the question becomes, when you talk about scenarios, is that at some point you got to do it, right? If the shock to the system, if the shock to your plans is too significant, then you got to do it. So yeah, I think I think you kind of nailed it in the sense that within a certain range, you have to do forecasting all the time, right? But not every forecast change will lead to this major budget change. Does that make sense?
Absolutely perfect.
Well, that would be my. But again, it'd be an interesting question to ask. Anybody else has any thoughts? Because that's what you guys do, don't you? Guys work in the real world. I'm just curious. How do you handle it?
Yeah, I've got some experience. At least with budgeting, I mean, putting a forecast together, like you said, it's a pretty time-consuming process. So it's not something you take lightly when you go and make changes for it. But if you don't have updates coming up to upper management, they're flying by the seat of their pants if they're not aware of, the inputs changing and what the effect's going to be to the entire company. So unless they're doing a high-level one, they're not going to know what's going on financially either. So, you need at least 2 or 3 a year, typically, to have a good idea of what's changing, because lots of times they're not even aware what's coming up in the next month, much less, 2, 3, 4 months down the road without those updates.
Yeah, so it's a balance between the two, I think, long-term versus short-term. All right, so we talked about budget ratcheting already. Next question, participative, so bottom-up budgeting, top-down budgeting. So you can budget could be either set from the top, meaning the upper management decides and kind of allocates to different divisions, versus you can have something called participative budgeting, when the information is being generated from the bottom of the organization, and it gets delegated up top, and people participate, people have inputs, lower-level employees have inputs into this process. Now, the advantages, disadvantages of each are pretty self-explanatory in a sense that the advantage of participating in budgeting is it potentially provides more detailed, better information. The disadvantage is that, of course, people, by providing information, they have the ability to manipulate it for their own benefit, right? Maybe set the goals too low, kind of being intentionally pessimistic. Top down has more control, but at the same time, it's more dictatorial, right? And it's not necessarily reflective of the reality. So that's basically what it is. Flexible budgeting is the budgeting, is a more scenario-driven budgeting, but it's driven by typically volume as our scenario, volume drive this different scenarios. This is our budget for this level of demand. This is our budget for that level of demand, right? And you build up different scenarios, and the budget makes it flexible from that perspective. Incremental versus zero-based budgeting. Most budgets are generated from the current year, right? Like that's the incremental budgeting. You just take, okay, what did I do this year? Let me take this year's budget and tweak it, maybe adjust for the expected level of demand. So you have a non-zero if the current year is the base, and that base is adjusted. You don't need to justify the base. On the zero-based budgeting, it says, okay, no, we don't care about what happened this year. Every line item is going to have a zero base. You justify it to me fully why you're asking for $10,000. Now, what is the advantage of zero-based budgeting? Potentially, it kind of, if Zimmerman points out that if there's a lot of turnover in upper management, the knowledge is potentially lost as to what justification is for various line items. And, therefore, if it's in particular in government with a lot of political appointees, they want to be explained, why are you asking for this money and what exactly did you do with it last year, and so on. I could say, all right, in line item budgeting. Well, line item budgeting, you guys heard of the term line item veto that the president has on the federal budget. So it's essentially where you budget typically budgets are just like the forecast that I showed you, they're a function of sales or volume or something like that, right? So there's some sort of a top line that drives everything else. Sales, you forecast your sales and you set your expenses, the percentage of your sales. Line item budgeting doesn't have that. Line item budgeting is said, okay, every line item will have its own independent justification. It's not driven by anything else. And line item budgeting, you see a lot more in, again, the government space, because everything needs to be separately justified. Obviously, it's a much more costly process.
Is the line item budgets driven by the fact that you've got authorizations for very specific funding, I guess? Is why they do that, or?
Yeah, exactly right. So, for example, when I was at the SEC, it was interesting. SEC obviously is a federal agency, Securities and Exchange Commission. I was in a division of economic risk analysis that, unlike the rest of the SEC, had its own budget line in the federal budget. And I forgot the term that they use in federal budgeting space. But essentially, the chairman of the SEC could not take our division money because of that and give it to some other division money, right? They could say, they couldn't take, suppose they felt that in Division of Investment Management or Trading and Markets, they needed more allocation this year. They couldn't shuffle it around. This was our money because the Congress allocated it specifically to us. So it has this, feature of hoarding off certain expenditures for particular purposes, I imagine.
Yeah, Professor, I'm actually in the government, but we call it appropriation and allocation. So you can't kind of cross colors of money when you're looking at line items, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense. Forgot the term. It'll come to me. They threw the term around. There's a separate.
Is it apportionment?
No, an apportionment is the allotment. There's the appropriation, allotment, and apportionment. That's just the way to allocate. So appropriation is kind of this gross big thing that the government, Congress allocates. Apportionment is when they won't give you all the money up front. Every quarter you get a portion, a part of it, right? If I recall correctly. And then that apportionment is allotted to specific line items. It's just a way to divvy up the pie across time and across different areas. That's actually specific only to federal budget. But we're talking about the more general terms because the federal, line item budget is just simply just saying that, that you don't give somebody a budget as a whole. I didn't say, okay, University of Baltimore, you can spend $10 million or $100 million this year. Now your president will decide how he's going to split it up. In a line item budget, the state of Maryland would say, okay, Baltimore, we're giving you $100 million, but you're going to spend $5 million on this, $10 million on this, and $3 million on that. And you can't move $5 million to $3 million. You can't switch them around. How could setting budget and operations versus financial terms help alleviate some problems that arise in traditional budgeting? So one of the issues that arise in traditional budgeting is that people are too oriented towards financial targets, for example. Okay, so I need to spend my 10 million. It doesn't matter what I'm going to do with it. I just need to spend it, or I need to meet this. So it kind of creates this distortionary incentives sometimes. So some people have proposed, okay, let's instead of telling University of Baltimore, okay, you got to meet your budget or whatever, we might tell them, which they do. If you look at the governor of Maryland's budget proposal, it will say, specific non-financial goals. Admit X number of students, admit Y number of minority students. And then it becomes much more difficult to do all kind of financial shenanigans with it. And those are my discussion questions.